Hi guys, it's time for our chat on teaching students to write chapter 4 by Beth Neman. I like to say, hello Neman, or how do you teach what Hillix wants you to teach? Hillix does a good job of telling us about the kinds of arguments he wants us to develop. And Gallagher talks all about, sort of in various strategies and various approaches to writing. But neither of them necessarily give us the minutia. That's what I sort of liked about the Neman book, except that her minutia was very minute, as you can see in that chapter. And so I'm trying to find this balance between just enough of the skills and the specifics that you need to teach and the engaging ideas that are offered in books like Hillix and Gallagher. So let's dive into some of those more specific things, especially about developing a student's essay. Let's just start by thinking about where we have been. We've been talking about invention thus far. We've looked at finding a topic. You'll remember the subject, topic, question, answer continuum I created, and we talked about in a previous chat. We've looked at strategies for coming up with ideas, the invention strategies that you all have written about and that we've talked about, my favorite being the 5 W's and H, but we've talked about cubing. You looked at invention strategies on those various online sites. We've talked about crafting a thesis with an argumentative edge, and that's why I like the although and the because clause, those elements that bring out the argumentative edge. And that's the focus of Hillix, the idea that we don't want these sort of bullshit, self-evident, facile theses. We want them to have that kind of edge, to be complex and complicated. And then we've talked about using the elements to begin writing with the rhetorical triangle. Right? And we looked at 3 levels of the rhetorical triangle. You remember that was the sort of crazy drawing I shared with you last week, I think, which was level 1, the rhetor, the audience, the content, and then remember the text was in the middle of the triangle. And then we have the claim, data, warrant levels, and then we have ethos, logos, pathos. And those are things we'll come back to all along. But that's part of the period of invention. So if you take a look at that last handout I gave you, where you have the triangle set up that way, and it asks you to identify a working thesis and talk about what the roles are of each. Who are you as rhetor? What do you know about your audience? What's the content going to be? And then what is the ethos? How are you going to sell yourself and prove that you are an expert? And how are you going to tap into the emotions of your audience? And then how are you going to use data that is logical and convincing? So that's where we've been. Now we're going to move on to a little bit more focus, sort of like we are funneling. My whole world is like one big funnel. So you remember the idea of the canons of rhetoric, right? Invention, disposition, and style. And we've just done invention. Now we're going to move into disposing of our ideas. And this is the nuts and bolts of writing. After we've invented, we dispose. That is, we begin to draft our ideas. So in thinking about teaching disposition, what you have to think about is what must you teach in order for students to be able to dispose of their ideas, and in what order do we teach them? So that's what we're moving on to now. These are the key elements of disposition, right? You have to dispose your thesis, which is the although and the because clause. Oh shit, this squeaky toy makes him start to sing. Anyway, we have the although and the because clause. And remember how I talk about that being a method of almost organizing? Although, Roman numeral 1, the first thing you're going to want to dispose of, then your contention, the second thing you're going to want to dispose of, and then your evidence that's going to support your contention. So we've got that there. The second thing you're going to want to talk about in disposition are introductions. Creating introductions. I got to take this toy away from him. 1 second. God, what a pain in the ass he can be. Anyway, the second element of disposition are introductions. How we begin to set up our idea. And you need to think about how you're going to teach introductions and what tools you have for teaching introductions. Then we're going to move into paragraph clusters, and we'll talk about what I mean by a paragraph cluster, or what Neman means by a paragraph cluster, and also how to teach it, and then conclusions. And so those are essentially the elements of a paper, right? Your 5-paragraph essay. It's not that much to teach, and you'll see that it's not that cumbersome to teach as long as we begin to unfold it for students with a clear order of development and some clear patterns and tools we can give them to make it easier. Our focus will be what we're going to call paragraph clusters. Most of our paragraphs will be of this ilk. We have introductions and conclusions, which are two different types of paragraphs that have their own sort of rules and structures, but the bulk of the writing that we do are these things we're going to call paragraph clusters. And so I want you to think about the challenges you'll face, and the things about paragraphs specifically you need to teach, and how you can imagine using articles, how you can teach these various elements using articles. And I want you, as I'm talking to you in these chats, to think about the yuck essays, more than the This American Lives, because those are not essays in the traditional form, but the yuck essays that are the same topic, but with a variety of audiences and a variety of tones, and a variety of information that they share. And then we'll focus on the various paragraphs that you have to teach. So these are the things we're going to do with paragraph clusters first. I'm one of those people who can't start writing a paper until I have a title. I just have to. And I have to write my introduction, even if I'm going to go back and revise it. So I have this very linear way of thinking. That might not be your way, and it might not be your student's way. So although I'm talking about starting with the introduction, it might not be the way that you do it. I think it's a good way to teach because it focuses students on the idea of the thesis, which has to orient the entire writing occasion. But as long as they have a working thesis, and although I contend because clause that they can keep in front of them, then they can begin to write the body of those paragraph clusters, without writing the introduction. But I like to start here because I think the introduction can help assuage the anxiety of a student writer by saying, okay, at least I know what it is I'm going to say. And it can generate enthusiasm because there's room to be a little bit more creative or fanciful, perhaps, in the introduction. The point is, an introduction must assert an organizing or controlling idea that is a thesis. And that's where you would put your although clause, although because clause, controlling idea. You don't add support. You just present what you're going to argue. Once again, please, please, please remember, the although I contend because model is a structure. It's a way to scaffold students. It does not have to appear that way. All those elements should appear, but the actual word although I contend because, those don't have to appear. I think for struggling writers, they're really good structure to latch onto, the idea of stem starters that I keep beating up. But anyway, the point is that you need to use the introduction to orient the readers. You have to tell them where you'll be taking them. And you want to remember to talk to your audience while you're writing. Students need to remember that they're going to be talking to the audience. And you need to say, this is where I'm going to be taking you. And here's the things I think you need to know. And here's how I am going to guide you or direct you. You want to suggest all of that so you're building their confidence in the reading that's going to take place. You're asking them to read stuff. You're asking them to come along on this journey of information or argument. And therefore, you want to make them feel confident. And that's why the introduction is so pivotal. Now, there are various methods for writing introductions, and we're going to take a look at those. Now, one of the things that's interesting, and I want to spend a second, is talking about text structures again, or conventions. Remember, in academic writing, indeed in all writing, we expect the opening, the first thing we read, to set us up. That goes back to the idea of text structures. Not in creative pieces where we don't mind en medias res, you might know that term from your study of literature, starting in the middle. We don't do that when we're trying to explain or argue something. We start at the beginning and walk our readers through. I think of generic conventions like starting with an introduction as prior knowledge. So say, for example, I teach poetry, and when I teach poetry, I tell students, before you even start to read, determine if there's a structure. So, and I think I did this with you guys in class. So if you open a poem and you see 14 lines, you think, okay, this might be a sonnet. And then you see an octave and a sestet, and you think Petrarch. And then you're saying, well, Petrarch, he puts the problem in the octave and the solution in the sestet. The point is that those conventions, that sense of you're knowing what you're doing, not only guides the reader, but it gives the reader some confidence that they're not going to be overwhelmed with something that is so new that they can't follow. So if students say to you, why do I have to start with my introduction? Why do I have to set it up? It's to create this congenial relationship with your reader, to make the material accessible to them, and to have them feel, okay, I can read this. I can do this. Remember, readers are often as anxious as our writers. So that's why relying on those conventions, those text structures, can be a really important tool for a writer as they develop a relationship with their audience. So remember, one of the things we want to do is make the reader feel comfortable, orient the reader. And so it's really key for us that we make this occasion of reading a pleasurable one. So this is why knowing the audience is important. You have to know what they need to know. And you want to know who your audience is, and you want to know what their predisposition is to the topic. So that's key. The other thing is you want to set the situation for the reader. You want to give them some context so that they understand what they're getting themselves into, some background. Again, think about the who, what, why, where, when, how of your reader. That's one of the reasons that I believe in starting with the although material. I think the although material can be really helpful in giving the reader some background and also in establishing your ethos or your credibility. Another thing that you can do when you're orienting the reader is starting with a specific instance, something that will be familiar to them. I think that if you think about the McLean piece, think about she starts being in an unfamiliar cultural situation. If you feel compelled to start with a quotation, say to your students, it better be something that appears later in the text of your essay, not some random bullshit quotation that they find in a Bartlett's or online from Thoreau or Gandhi or something. No. If you're not writing about the person saying the quotation, you do not include that quotation. Please, please, please. I also like the idea of the inverted triangle, where you funnel the reader from a broad topic to a narrow one, so you're working towards focusing the reader as you lead them to your thesis, which is what the end of your introduction should be. You should be leading your reader to the thesis, setting them up for that thesis. So I like that sort of funnel image, just like the funneling we've done with invention. And in the same way we hook our audience when we're teaching a lesson, we need to hook our reader. So you can use, and these are some of the things that you can talk about and teach, the same way you teach invention strategies. So you could talk about some interest-provoking rhetorical question. But remember the proviso about rhetorical questions. They're not really looking for an answer, so you don't want to overuse them. So you want to be careful. You could start with some pointed statements, something that is a little bit provocative, or some particular statistic or piece of data that is engaging. Again, a relevant quotation, a comparison, something that the reader might know and you want to introduce them to a new topic. The idea of a paradox, that you would think X, but in reality Y. An incident, again, think about McLean. What I want you to do is you look at all of these various hooks, is think about the stuff you've been reading and see where you see them at play. That's why we teach hooks using multiple examples of the essays you select in class. You select essays, you use them to teach the hooks, you look at how the reader introduces the topic and builds to a thesis. You practice various methods, all of those options that were on the previous slide. You practice them the same way you do invention, getting students to try them all on for size and maybe find the one that works. The thing is that you want to vary the types of hooks you use depending on your audience. In the essays from the readers that you will have in school, or essays in the newspaper or a history book, always take a look at how does the author hook, connect, set up the reader for what's about to occur. We're going to try exercises that revise the intros of examples. So for example, you might take a look at a really boring introduction and say to students, let's rewrite this with a quotation, or let's find an analogy that we can use. Rewriting, or what I call revising, the examples that you're sharing with them is empowering to students. The point is they have to pay attention to how we engage the reader from the minute they open our assignment, the same way they do with lesson plan. The same way you hook a student with a lesson plan. They don't always have to be sexy, but they always have to engage, okay? So we'll do that. We'll talk about that with the Yuck essays next class. And now I'm going to move on to talking about the other parts in the next chat. Okay? Cool.